students in master degree. Then she is now in US.
She is? Where are
Yeah.
you?
Yeah, when I see your website last night, I feel like that I have to plan to travel to DC.
Absolutely, I would love to see you, but just know
Yeah.
that it has to be in the fall because we're not open yet.
Yeah, that's right.
But you are now in Connecticut, right?
Yeah,
Gumra?
that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Oh, you're at the University of Connecticut?
I used to be in, right now I'm like a guest student at University of Connecticut. I take some courses there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I think it's 4:30 now. Shall we start? Yeah. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Thank you all for being with us. Today we have very special guest and a friend and colleague. She is very well known. I think most of people here know you very well, Rena. And they learn a lot. We learn a lot from your articles, presentation, and many things, many of your scientific work. First, I know Rena was in South Korea, I think 2003 or 2004, when she was presenting Catalyst program. And it was really one of the best program that I ever seen till now. I think it's the best one that I ever seen. And thankfully that she accepted some of our students there. Okay. Rena, I think you are muted right now. Just, yeah. Okay.
Can you say that again? Because I love hearing about the Saudi students.
Yeah, I think Saudi students who participate in Catalyst were only international students.
Correct.
Yeah. So we appreciate that very much. And our students now, they became the 6 students were there. All of them are now scholars in at the universities. I think Nawaf will be here too today. I invited
Really?
Nawaf, and I think, yeah, I think he will, he will attend. Hopefully soon. Rena Shabbatnik also as one of the leader in the field, and I could say very few people or scholars in the field who are loved in both ways, in their professional and their personality. So many people like Rena for both of her work and for her personality. She is a wonderful person, as she is a wonderful scholar. I don't want to go more and more, and that's a lot of things to say about Rena actually, but I will ask now Gumra to introduce Rena formally. تفضلي قمرة.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Thank you, Dr. Rena, for your time, and thank you for your flexibility with our schedule this morning. Please allow me to introduce you for my professors and colleagues before we start the presentation. حياكم الله جميعا. حيا الله جميع أساتذتنا ومعلمينا. حيا الله جميع الأخوة والأخوات من الزملاء والزميلات. اسمحوا لي بتقديم بسيط عن الدكتورة رينا قبل البدء بالعرض التقديمي. الدكتورة سابتنيك عملت كمدير لمركز علم النفس في جمعية علم النفس الأمريكية، التي تتمثل مهمتها في نشر الوعي العام وتأييد الأفكار البحثية المتطورة التي تعزز من إنجازات الأطفال والمراهقين الموهوبين وأدائهم في جميع المجالات. عملت أيضاً الدكتورة سابتنيك أستاذ التربية السابق بكلية هنتر، حصلت على العديد من الجوائز من ضمنها جائزة الإنجاز مدى الحياة من قبل مؤسسة مينسا للتعليم والبحوث. أيضاً الدكتورة سابتنيك مؤلف مشارك في العديد من المؤلفات من بينها تنمية المواهب كإطار لتعليم الموهوبين، الآثار المترتبة على أفضل الممارسات والتطبيقات في المدارس. أيضاً من ضمن المؤلفات فجوة المواهب، الولايات المتحدة تتجاهل طلابها الواعدين في العلوم، رعاية عبقرية الشباب، تجديد التزامنا بتعليم الموهوبين هو مفتاح لمجتمع أكثر إبداعاً وإنتاجاً وثراء ثقافية. أيضاً من ضمن المؤلفات إعادة التفكير في الموهبة والتعليم الموهوب اتجاه مقترح إلى الأمام. أيضاً عملت الدكتور سابتنيك كمحرر مشارك في علم نفس الأداء العالي، تطوير الإمكانات البشرية في المواهب الخاصة. أيضاً العقول المرنة، ترجمة الرؤى من علم النفس وعلم الأعصاب إلى تعليم الموهوبين وتطوير المواهب عبر الحياة. Dr. Shabbatnik, you can start the presentation now.
Thank you so much.
Can you see people? I think you can see them. You asked to see people. I think some people are their camera on right now. If you want to see.
I just see you, and then the others are still pictures or names. But it's okay, as long as I have a feeling I'm talking to people. Thank you, Dr. Osama, for doing that.
You want us to open the cameras?
Pardon
Yes,
me?
please.
It's just nicer to talk to people than to just talk to the screen. So, first I want to tell you, I appreciate I didn't have to do this too early in the morning, but in the morning is very special for me because I drink my Bahraini coffee, which is so delicious and was new to me as an experience. So I just finished my second cup of Bahraini coffee and now I'm ready. So thank you, Dr. Abdullah, for inviting me and for recounting our long friendship. I want to talk with you today about trends in the US and in gifted education in general, and how my colleagues and I are trying to address some of those problems, some new things we've been thinking about, and because they're new, it's especially interesting to hear your thoughts about it and whether our ideas are even relevant to your situation and culture and interests and goals. Next slide, please. So gifted education is under attack in the US right now. And to tell you the truth, it's not a new thing. We've had ups and downs in the history of education and people's sensations or reactions to gifted education. But very recently, actually, Kamra might have been at this conference that the National Research Group at the University of Connecticut just reported some really depressing news from my perspective. And that was that if gifted programs were very low impact, another low dose, once a week enrichment programs, that children were not achieving academically as they should, and that children who were very bright but didn't participate in these programs were doing as well or better. So if I were a parent and I were thinking about my child going into a secondary program, a special school, or a special international baccalaureate program or whatever, I would be concerned that my child should be as achieving as highly as possible in school, because those programs, getting into those programs requires that you have high levels of achievement. So now people are saying, well, what are you doing for my child? So that's one problem. There's a disturbing lack of diversity in these programs. This is a long-standing problem, but for some reason it seems to get worse. And what I mean by that is the US is a very diverse country, and the schools, particularly the public schools, are very diverse. So can we for example, in the top school in the US is Thomas Jefferson High School in this region here where I live. They admit 500 students a year. And anywhere between 14 and 20 of them every year are African American. In an area where the schools are, 30, 40, sometimes 50% African American. And this is just of great concern to the public. That's saying, why does this happen year after year? Some of it is deep-seated poor education in preparation for these schools. Some of it is due to the fact that parents don't learn about preparing to get into these schools in an equal way. So there are a lot of problems on that front. And then finally, another long-standing problem is if one of our goals is on a national level that we want to develop talent to make the world a better place and help solve our problems, we have not found strong connections between how we traditionally identify children and who ends up being the contributors to society. So those are some of the problems, some of them long-standing, some of them, the first one I mentioned here has some new research that's shaking people up. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do today, see, I'm a good teacher with the agenda for us. We're going to talk about the ingredients of talent development, which takes a different approach to gifted education. The fact that the focus of talent development is on creative productivity, and some more work we've been doing recently that is still under construction, and we'd like to I'd love to hear what you think about it. Mm-hmm. Next, please. Okay, so why talent development? Talent development focuses on talent in domains. So in other words, in traditional gifted education, you take an IQ test and it's supposed to measure general ability. And not all great thinkers have this general ability, but they're amazing in, for example, mathematics. But their language is average, or even above average, but not at the gifted level. And I've seen this myself when I worked, we had a laboratory school in New York City where we took students who had to pass these very high level general tests. And we did not admit one of the most brilliant mathematicians in the city because his language, his English language was okay, but not great. But his math was off the top. So We argue it's more important to focus on domain-specific talent. It's easier for the public to understand the idea of having a program for gifted mathematicians or writers or musicians rather than someone who's a gifted person. Further, when you have courses, when you have programs like that, the courses and the activities have less variation in the participants' abilities. Again, at this laboratory school, all of the children were at 97th percentile IQ and above, every one of them. But by second grade, there was huge variation in how well they could read and how well they could do mathematics. And so, of course, the variation was smaller than in a regular school, but there was still tremendous variation. Whereas if you have a special program, let's say for mathematics or for science, the variation is less and it's just more efficient to be able to teach that way. The next thing to think about with identification by domains is that they tend to be relevant to the abilities and not abstract. And I'll talk more about that later. But I would like to just tell you an anecdote that this is about music. It's not about school-related giftedness, but there is a famous school for music and drama and dance in New York called the Juilliard School. And I went there to find out how they do their admission criteria to the school. They have a program for pre-university students age 4 to 18 who are very gifted in music. And I asked them to tell me how did they identify the children. And the admissions director said, it's all very public. You can look on the website and you can see if you are 4 years old and you're applying for piano, this is what you must be able to do. So, and because this is publicly available, any teacher, music teacher in the world can look at this and say, okay, if I want my best students to apply here, I know exactly what I need to teach them. Now, of course, you have to be expressive, et cetera, in being able to perform, but at least you know the content. Whereas for us, most tests that students take to get admitted are mysterious, and you're not allowed to know what's on them, and no one can prepare in a good way. And if you're going to be able to prepare, it should be available to everyone, not just a few parents who happen to know how to do it. So with support comes public resources and recognition. If these programs were easier to understand and to rationalize, we believe there would be more support. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, I'm just realizing okay. So in 2009, I was approached by a group called the Association for Psychological Science, and they offered the opportunity to research and write a piece on gifted students and gifted education. And they gave me money, and they asked me to organize a team to look at this concept. So we looked in the psychological literature very broadly at gifted, the words gifted, giftedness, talent, creativity, eminence, high performance, and talent. which was very exciting to have this chance to immerse ourselves in the literature. And our goal was to summarize the best work into a number of principles, which we then call the mega model. Now, because we use the words high performance, we also got a chance to look at the gigantic and exciting domain of sport. Because think about it, who spends more money than anyone else on developing talent in the world? And I would bet this is true to a certain degree in the GCC, but in South America, Europe, US, sports, they spend millions of dollars cultivating talent. So it seemed like a good idea to look at what do they do, and is there anything we could learn from it? And we also looked at the performers, like music performers, etc. Okay, so what did we find? And my two colleagues who are fantastic, and I hope you'll get a chance to meet them as well. The person on top is Paula Olszewski-Kubilius from Northwestern University. And she runs huge talent search programs in that region of the country. And the second one is Frank Worrell, who is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. He's a school psychologist, and he also runs summer programs for students, but studies. Both of them are very interested in underserved students, and they're both highly prolific researchers. So we had a year to dive into this, and here's what we came up with. That talent is expressed in domains and is malleable and has to be developed. So this is in contrast to identifying someone with a high IQ and you are gifted for life. Okay, which is the traditional perspective. Second, which was a pretty radical, is that different talent domains have different trajectories. I'll talk more about that shortly. That talent development is not something that just takes place in school, but it also takes place in collaboration with the community at the, parallel, and also beyond school. In other words, into higher education and professional education. We also discovered through the research that over time, psychosocial skills, that is self-confidence, courage, how you get along with people, plays a greater and greater role in whether your talent is manifested. Think about it for a second, even amongst yourselves, that if you have a whole slew of graduate students, let's say, who are equally talented, what's going to make the difference in whom you might recommend for something or other, or push in a certain direction? Sometimes it's how persuasive they are, how well they communicate, how well they know how to negotiate different situations. That's not the talent itself in mathematics, but it's an additional talent that you need to develop over time, and it's teachable. And then finally, the goal of talent development is to help individuals, excuse me, channel their talent into creative contributions, which is also different perspective from the traditional gifted education, which is about self-fulfillment. So you are a gifted person, and our job is to help you fulfill your personal, whatever it is. It could be contributing and it could be not. So I know many of you have been exposed to the Renzulli triad, and so you can see its contributions to this as well. This was a compilation, that's why we called it the mega models. We drew from a lot of different important researchers. Okay, next please. Yeah, I won't spend time on this, but I hope you'll have access to it because it describes the mega model in a figurative manner. So if you don't have access to it, I can send a version that you can look at more closely. But just to show that the first row on the top is about development, that it's, you know, giftedness changes from childhood to adulthood. If you're a gifted child, it doesn't mean you're going to be a gifted adult, okay? But you can develop your childhood giftedness and you'll have a better chance of being a gifted adult. The second and third rows indicate that different domains start at different times. So if you want to be a dancer, at least now, you usually must start around age 8 in the classical dance education. Whereas if you want to be a psychology scholar, you may not even know about it until you're in university or in later secondary school. So this is just to keep in mind. Second, as I was saying before, content knowledge and skills are super important, but over time, the people who are still considered gifted all know a lot. So there are other factors that make them different from one another. And that's that psychosocial skills and insider knowledge. Take a sip of water here, excuse me. The thin green, I'm sorry. The thin green line is capitalizing on given chance and opportunities, means that people have to take the opportunities we offer them. And then finally, the expectation is to work towards creative productivity or eminence or transformative creativity. Next slide, please. Okay. So just a little bit more about this. I'll move through this quickly so I can get to the new stuff. I'm not sure how familiar you are with all of this. So general ability tests can surely be useful with young children and students who've had limited opportunities. In fact, just recently I met someone who retired as chair of the board of Bank of America, which is the second biggest bank in the US. And he grew up very poor and Black in a small town in, I'm sorry to say this, the worst part. I wouldn't want to live there for anything. Terrible place. And he took a test, was identified for a program to do early college. So he left his secondary school and went to university. And his university was paid for. He became a theoretical physicist and head of the bank, but before the bank, he was head of several universities. He was the provost of the University of California system. I mean, amazing, right? And without that test, who knows what would have happened to him. So tests can be useful, these general tests, in identifying people who are brilliant and undiscovered. But in many ways, it would be really ideal if we could switch the process of identification followed by programming to offer programming and then see how children respond to it. So that's an ideal concept. And that what we'd love to see among graduate students is for them to be thinking about a variety of assessments that can be used for domain-specific abilities, because there are many in some fields, but not in others. Okay, thank you. Can you go to the next one? So here's an example about mathematics. I apologize. I was contracted to help the Quran Institute, which is a mathematics institute at the New York University. And they had programs for children, free programs for children in public after-school programs. And they wanted to identify more kids who might really benefit from their work. So they asked me to do a review of the literature and see what different ideas we could have about mathematics other than achievement tests from school. Now, why is that important dichotomy? Because school mathematics, and I'll bring this up several times, and you can tell me if it's different in the GCC or in Saudi Arabia, but school mathematics is very different from what mathematicians do. So it's very limited part of mathematics. And what they're interested in, this Mathematics Institute at NYU, is more what's seen as recreational mathematics, sort of the aesthetic part of mathematics, more the geometry and patterns, etc. So there's a big literature on the predictive ability of something called number sense, which means children's understanding of the relationship of numbers to one another. And you can see, even in kindergarten children, advanced number sense that predicts achievement, not only in later elementary school, but in high school. And it's very powerful literature. But it doesn't talk about mathematical creativity or an expanded view of what mathematics is and what mathematicians do. So I looked to some other areas of research that focus more on the creativity aspect. And there's a wonderful scholar who's no longer with us, named Krutetsky, who was a Soviet psychologist who studied in the 70s, who studied giftedness in mathematics. And I would urge you to see if you can find his work, if you're interested in this. I know it's translated into English through the University of Chicago, but I'm not sure what other languages. Basically, he talked about creative mathematicians having a mathematical cast of mind. And what that means is that if left to their own devices in a neutral environment, they would be focused on mathematical questions rather than other types of questions. So my long-standing example is when I used to go on long trips with my parents, I grew up in New York City. We would take trips out of the city when it was really hot and whatever. And I would entertain myself in the car by looking in other cars and saying, oh, I wonder, is this a family? Do they like each other? Are they happy? What's happening? Where are they going? So that's how my mind was going. I took my nephew on a trip maybe 20 years ago. And I said to him, and he was quiet and he was looking out the window. And I said to him, what are you thinking about? And he said, I wonder what the likelihood is that the next license plate is going to be from Texas. You know, this is like the last thing I would be thinking about. But he was looking for patterns and predictions. And everything he concerned himself with was about patterns and predictions. And he's now a theoretical chemist at the University of Pennsylvania. So that's a just very broad example, but it's a kind of way of looking at the world that either is inherent, we don't know, or you can develop. You can tell kids, you can ask kids, what kinds of questions can you ask about this playground, about this museum, about this park, etc. And then the question of insight which also can be trained. Can you see errors in judgment? Can you see trick questions, etc.? These are all very important in creative mathematics. And I just want to point out one other thing to think about, and that is there's a medical institute called the Howard Hughes Medical Institute that their education head asked me if we could have a conversation. And what they have high school programs for students to come into their labs. They do very, frontier medical research. And he said, I'm very concerned because the way we invite people is based on their math scores on standardized tests. And they traditionally took kids in the 99.99.99 percentile in math because they could only take a few, and this was a convenient way to do it. But he said, math is important, but it's not the most important criterion for a medical researcher. So, in other words, they need to have a sense of patterns. I mean, the kind of traditional math on those tests, they need to have a sense of patterns. They need to have an intuition. And he was just concerned that a lot of kids who would be great future medical researchers were not getting a chance because it was so, the gatekeeper was this very, 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 very high cutoff score. So Dr. Abdullah, I see there are sometimes hands. Do you want to do this at the end?
Yes, it will be the end, please.
The end? Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going a little slower than I'd hoped. So I'll try to move more quickly.
Yeah.
Next slide, please. Okay, the other principle was that different domains vary when they begin. And let me go to the next slide and I'll indicate that a little better. Okay, so we did a chart of domains. We had music, athletics, and academics. And even within domains, you can start at different times. So violin, very early, and then voice and wind instruments later because of physical development, right? You have to have your lungs more physically developed. In sport, there are certain sports like gymnastics that start young, but more and more, the research in sport is showing that it's not good to start too early in a specific sport. That in fact, it can harm somebody physically, that it leads to burnout, etc. And so the argument in sport is even in the elite sports, to do general conditioning, a broad range of activities, and then start to specialize in whether it's, soccer or whatever. And in the academic domains, math can start very early. It doesn't mean that someone couldn't start later, but you could start to look for mathematical talent very young. Whereas with psychology, who hears about psychology, you know, except in the common language until you're much older? And we can talk about that a little bit more later. Next slide. The implications, very briefly. So you can't just say, okay, we're going to have gifted identification at age 8. And the reason that age 8 was established was because that was when researchers found that IQ scores were the most stable. Before that, they were less stable. So they said, okay, 8-year-old, if you do an IQ test, it's a, you know, stable. But if we're interested in developing talent in domains, it shouldn't be just one age because it'll vary by the domain. This makes our life more complicated, but I would say it's our responsibility if we want to get more kids into developing their creative potential. So the implication is to maintain general enrichment and general gifted education for kids who are good in school and or have high IQs. And then once you develop a real interest in talent, then you start to specialize. And the other is to consider, this is kind of experimental, that some of the areas like psychology, well, why not introduce it earlier, right? Not necessarily the therapeutic parts of psychology, which are not appropriate to be, you know, teaching to children, but to the more experimental parts of psychology about cognition and perception, etc., that kids can understand, and the psychological research, how you do survey research, etc. Or engineering. Most kids don't have exposure to engineering until later, or philosophy. And there are wonderful programs in philosophy, for example, for young kids that could in fact help us find kids who are potential future philosophers. Next, please. But none of this matters if we don't offer them opportunities. This trajectory, developmental trajectory, comes from the work of Benjamin Bloom, 1985, Developing Talent in Young People, the best book in the world on this. And he looked at 3 domains: academics, sport, and the arts, and took retrospective studies of 120 people who were world renowned. And what he found was that there were 3 stages. And the first stage is having a teacher or parents that help you to fall in love with something. Okay, so that first exposure is joyous and playful. But after a while, that's not enough. You know, if you really love something, you want to know more about, how do I become one of those? What skills do I need? How do I belong? So a second set of teachers, usually they're not the same person, teaches the skills, knowledge, and values of this particular area. And then in the last stage is more of a mentorship, where the person is working to help you identify your own voice, your own niche that you're going to cultivate. Next slide, please. So some practical implications. It's kind of sad, but true, that it's by chance you end up born in a family that has certain interests and friends, etc. So I went to a concert once. It was a jazz concert, and there was a little boy sitting behind me with his family, and he talked very enthusiastically in between pieces, making comments about the drummer. And I thought, this boy is 5 years old. How would he possibly know anything about this? Well, it turned out then, after the break, the next act came up, and it was his family that was, a jazz orchestra. So he grew up with it. This was his life. He knew so much because it was his family. And there are other families who are multilingual, and their children are so much more advanced in learning new vocabulary because they just have a feel for language. So it's really by chance that you grow up in a family with certain values and certain interests. So if you're lucky, your interests will coincide, because young kids want to please. They want to feel part of things. So they respond either through intrinsic motivation or to please or to make some kind of a statement. And then it's parents' difficult choice to use pressure or support. Sometimes the interest will flag. I'm sure you've all had this experience where your child or you have been interested in something, and then it gets to the point where you have to practice or study or whatever it is, and it's not so appealing anymore. So then in the beginning period, parents have to do a certain amount of pressure to get kids past the basics. Because once you get past the basics, then things become much more interesting. On the other hand, if you pressure for too long in the process, then that can be counterproductive. And another implication is the first teacher really makes a big difference. So, I'm looking at this picture below, and it's kind of this kind of imperious music teacher. He doesn't look very friendly or supportive. And I think many middle-class parents in the US have, give their children music lessons because it's supposed to make you, more cultured and disciplined. But if you have a bad teacher, it's a waste of money, right? Because nothing much happens. Okay, next, please. I mentioned earlier that talent development is a long-term process from having abilities that are developed into competencies, into expertise, and then beyond into artistry and scholarly creative productivity. And the levers for this are opportunity, we just talked about, the effort people put into it, and practice and motivation. And I have to tip my hat here to Robert Sternberg, who helped us think about developing expertise. Next. The implications for this, devotion of time, financial resources. This is, again, a chance factor. If you're born into a family that cannot afford to give you either tuition to a program or to equipment that you need, or to an instrument, or to tutoring, it's very difficult. And this is the role we as educators and psychologists and support personnel and parents can take to try to equalize. I do want to point out that having a passion and developing it for a child or adolescent to the fullest does not mean a lifetime commitment. Okay, this is not one of these programs, we're not asking you to think, okay, we're identifying people at 8 And for national reasons, they must be a scientist or a whatever. But we argue that diving into something that you're passionate about is a good experience, because so few people get a chance to do that in their youth, to really dive deeply into something. Even if at a certain point you say, I love this, but this is not what I want to do for life. So I know it's a little bit more challenging in if I'm not mistaken, in the GCC countries, and actually in most countries in the world, when you go to university, you go in as a major. You know, you start medical school or law school or psychology, etc. Right. In the US, we have a delayed situation of undergraduate education where you don't have to commit for another 2 years. But it may be, you'll have to tell me during the question and answer, but it may be changing in some of your countries that people can switch at a certain point. But in youth, there may be somebody who's just great in mathematics, but then gets to the point where he or she says, you know what, I'm good at it, but I'm not interested in spending my time asking mathematical questions, which is what you need to do to be a mathematician. And, you know, would be unfortunate for that person to then have to devote his or her life to something that that's not their creative bent. Okay, next. So we need to give them a lot of opportunities for creative production, and we don't always get to do that in our classes, but in talent development, gifted education, that should be part of the focus. And the creative activities would be in the domain, so not just kind of generic generic creativity activities. And then finally, and I'll bring this up again, being creative gets a lot of support unless you're badly behaved in school. But when you're an adult, or, you know, almost an adult, and you come up with something really creative that is against the status quo, it can be a very, very difficult and even dangerous pursuit. And we need to be very explicit with kids, because they don't understand. You know, you keep telling me, come up, oh, we love your creative ideas. Well, now I'm being creative, and there needs to be kind of an understanding of consequences. And I'm going to be talking about that shortly. Okay, next. Well, we can offer all the opportunities in the world, but some people don't take them. This is the most frustrating thing in my life, is, you know, having these programs and then kids won't even enroll, or if they enroll, they do it half-heartedly. And well, from what we could find, some of them are just not interested in something they're good at. All right? Most of them are afraid they're going to fail. And if they've been rewarded for being smart and wonderful, and then they get put into a more challenging environment, they're afraid they won't be able to live up to this experience, live up to their reputation. They may have other things that they like to do, or friends, you know, being around friends. They think their friends or their parents won't approve of their participation. It might be, for example, in the US, many families who are new immigrants want their children, understandably, to have secure lives. So they want them to be professionals. So they feel this pressure to be a professional. And I was the child of immigrants, and so I totally get it. but some of them are just super talented in art. Okay, so there's that dilemma for the child, and is very interesting part of our lives. And then other kids have drive, but they don't have social skills that they need to get mentors. So we'll talk about that. Next, please. So social skills, as I mentioned earlier, are made up of mental skills and social skills. They are not a substitute for hard work or talent, and they're not inherent. Some people are born very social, very, really know themselves, and or they grow up in a family where that is important and they practice it. But these are teachable skills, okay, with individual differences. Next, please. So, for example, everyone has these problems, okay? So this is not a clinical problem. This is, everyone has these problems. That is focusing on avoiding distractions. How many times are you trying to write something and the slightest noises are driving you crazy? Your phone is going off. All of these things are distractions. Overcoming fears. One of the top 10 fears for humans is public speaking, right? Everyone's terrified. I was terrified this morning. I had to, just do this whole thing, and you can get coaching to help. So it's not, and some of the most amazingly famous performers are a wreck, before and after their presentation. So it's good to share with kids that these are normal human fears, and that you can fix them or you can practice them. How to take strategic risks and deal with chance factors. So for example, let's say you're second in some challenge at school. You didn't come in first in the science fair, but not because of you, but some chance factor, the kid who was first gets sick. So then all of a sudden you're supposed to get up there and represent the school as, that's a chance factor that you can learn to take that risk and capitalize on it. If you're not ready, if you just say, oh, well, he got it, so it's over, that's not good. So in a good talent development program, we talk about always being ready for chance opportunity. And this happens very, very often, and it's probably happened in your own lives as well. Persisting through good and bad times. So we all know about persisting through bad times, but sometimes when things are going really well, we also get lazy. So talking with kids, say, I do this, you do this. Let's just make these out there as human problems that we can learn how to address. And then, dealing with delayed gratification, that sometimes you can't have what you want right now because it's a distraction from what you really want down the road. And of course, there are the famous marshmallow experiments that confirmed that. And we can talk, if you're not familiar with that, I know Dr. Abdullah is nodding his head, so I believe he knows those quite well. So these are developmental in nature and trainable with guidance and practice. And I spent 3 years observing in a music conservatory, and they teach these, they have explicit classes where they teach these skills at the Juilliard School because they're so important to becoming a musician. Well, it's important to becoming a good student as well. Next, please. These are the mental skills of Olympic champions from the literature, what the school psychologist teaches, and you can go on. I'm arguing that students also need these skills. Next. All right, I see I have to go much faster. I'm sorry. Social skills are how do you attract mentors and supporters, and how do you become a good and reliable colleague? We all know you get jobs, for example, somebody will put your name forward, right? If you're known as a jerk, even if you're brilliant, there's somebody else who's brilliant who's not a jerk, right? And so having a
يلا حسين
sorry
احفظ اللي طلع عليك.
So talking with kids about social skills because they help you get what you want and because it's the right thing to do. So next, please. So as I said, instrumentally, you're more likely to get what you want, and life is much more pleasant when you interact with others, not fraught by misunderstanding. So it's a good investment to learn how to be a good teammate, how to be a good colleague, how to work with others, how to be dependable, and how to be persuasive. Next. So that's the essence of the summary of the literature. So what comes next, please? Once you have a creative idea, you have to do a few things, and that is to think about the consequences of instituting the idea. Now, there are many scientific discoveries that people made, got the Nobel Prize for, etc., but then people went and used it for evil purposes. And, you know, that's a whole debate. Are you responsible if you come up with a creative idea and somebody then manipulates it inappropriately? This is all great conversation for gifted students, particularly if they're a little older. Now, what if you come up with a great idea, you've thought about the consequences, and you want to persuade others to consider it? Just because you say it doesn't mean people are going to be persuaded. You have to prepare yourself for rejection and moving forward. And what happens if you shake the status quo? Next, please. Just thinking about consequences, there are programs for kids that you can work with that talk about these things. So I just wanted to bring them up, but I wrote down some here. So let's say the first order of consequences might be getting people, a creative way to get people to wear masks. Okay. The second order consequences of the pandemic might have longer term effects of the decision. Well, you know, if people are wearing masks and they have to have social distancing, then many businesses can't function. You know, let's say you're a hairdresser or whatever, that people they couldn't for many months continue with their business. So that's a second order consequence. How do you deal with people losing their jobs because of safety? And some governments said, well, too bad. And other governments were very supportive of people who had these kind of jobs and gave them some living expenses. And then the third order consequences are the effects beyond that. And that's what we're starting to think about now. Will we ever have the same life we had before? Or will school and work always look different because of this experience we've had? And so there's creative. So when you come up with a creative idea, it's good, even if it solves the first problem, there are other consequences in the long term and to other people. And that's a big responsibility for kids, but it's good for them to know that they should think this way. Next. So let me move through this rapidly. Once you have an idea or a solution, consider the consequences. There are 4 things you should have in your toolkit. One is the social skills. We talked about that. The second is communicating persuasively. If we could move on. Again. I'm just really sorry I talked so slowly, but I want you to think about this, and then maybe you'll invite me back and we can have the second half of this. So if any of you have been to business school, you might have encountered Robert Cialdini or the science of persuasion, because it's mostly affiliated with marketing. You know, how do you get people to buy another pair of sneakers they don't need? So, but it's also being used very effectively in healthcare in getting people to be more compliant with doctor's orders. So how do you get people to make sure to take their medication 3 times a day? Or how do you get people to get vaccinated? So these are all persuasion techniques. Next. So right now, my office is doing some work with scholars in healthcare and in environmental climate change issues who use the principles of persuasion that have been mostly affiliated with marketing for good purposes. So I would love to talk more with you, and I'm going to leave. I'm going to say just a little bit about that, but maybe we can talk about this another time. So there are different principles, and they're listed here. One of them that's probably the most common is scarcity. So seeing things that are rare as more valuable. And also this white lab coat experience. I went to an experimental school when I was a child, and in the 5th grade, I had this teacher who said, look at these advertisements on television where they have a man in a white coat with a stethoscope around his shoulder, and he's saying 4 out of 5 doctors prescribe such and such. I don't know if you have advertisements like this in the GCC, but we had, many advertisements like that. And the teacher said, how do we know this person is actually a doctor? Right? I mean, he's just wearing a white coat. He could be an actor and if he says 4 out of 5 doctors, how do we know how many doctors they asked? What if they only asked 5 doctors? So this was, my first experience to persuasion being used in advertising. And after that, I was much more sensitive about it, but I also know it has great impact on people if they think that everyone else around them, people they like, their friends, their community is doing something, they're more likely to do it. Okay. Next slide. Why do these principles work? Because we have so much decision fatigue in our lives, so many choices to make, so many, especially under difficult conditions. Imagine these healthcare workers with emergency COVID people coming in and no time, worried about their families. So you become very susceptible to persuasion and not being able to sort out what's right and what's not right. And teachers, of course, in the classroom are undergoing the same kind of difficulties with, hybrid online in the classroom, parents much more involved in a whole different way. And so sometimes they'll make decisions, be more susceptible to influence than they might be otherwise when they can be more contemplative. Next. So, I mean, I give some examples here. Sometimes people want their child, the scarcity principle in a gifted program, not because it's the program that's best for their child, but just because it's scarce and not everyone can get in. Now, that might be a cultural thing too. Maybe that's not the case in Saudi Arabia, but it is where I live. So, you know, it's very challenging. Next. Reciprocity, just, you know, if you ever go to a conference and they give you pens or books or mugs with the logo, there's a sense of, I want to give back. So the next time somebody says, oh, I wonder where I could get one of those mugs, or where I could ask for something, you'll think of the mug and the pen and whatever. It's because we feel this need to owe something that you get for free. Once again, that might be cultural, I don't know, but it works, at least in the US. And this is, you know, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. That's the picture of the two primates up there. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, so our goal is we want to teach these skills to students so they can help convince people of their ideas. But it's equally important to teach them these skills so that they're not susceptible to inappropriate use of these things on them and their families. Next. Another area we're exploring now is just insider knowledge or the game. One thing that's very challenging for parents who are not well connected is, how do I give advice to my child that other parents already know? Same with graduate students. Some of them come from families who've had, you know, long tradition of academia, and they know what to do. They know how to act. They know how to use their time. And so our job also is to broadly share insider knowledge. Bob Sternberg calls it, and Wagner call it, practical intelligence. But it's not, I would argue it's not an intelligence, it's something you teach and share with people. Okay, next. I keep looking up because my clock is up here and I realize I want to give you a chance to ask questions. So just, it levels the playing field. A mentor can help with this. So that's why acquiring a mentor is so important. Next. Just an example that researchers have discovered that there are some teachers who are called influencers in a school community, that other teachers listen to them, and they may or may not be in a position of leadership. Often they're not, they're just one of the teachers, but when they say something, other people will do it. And so the task for researchers is to find that person and convince them, because if they convince them, they're more likely to get teachers to do things, as opposed to going through the principal, or you, of course you have to talk to the principal and keep them informed. In psychology, Bob Sternberg writes about, you know, how do you get tenure? How do you choose to use your time? Sports prodigies, there's also, you know, now telling kids not to burn out and to, you know, train more broadly. Next. Finally, again, we have to help kids operate with courage. So they're going to be creative if they want, you know, to challenge the medical establishment or, the writing establishment, well, they'll have to be courageous or not. They should know what the consequences are. Next. So putting it all together, the talent development approach helps to broaden the gifted population. I'm not talking about just saying everybody's gifted. I'm talking about people are gifted, but they're not identified as generally gifted. So if we have the generally gifted and those who are gifted in special areas, we will broaden the gifted population, which is really important. It becomes more understandable for the public and politically viable. It's focused on constructive, productive contributions. And to do this, we're going to have to add to our toolbox, capitalizing on social skills, persuasion, insider knowledge, and mental skills. Okay. Next. Shukran. Okay.
So thank you very much, Professor Rena, for this wonderful presentation. I think we have around 15 minutes for conversation and discussion. قمرة تفضلي.
نعم دكتور عبد الله. في حال وجود الأسئلة باللغة العربية تكتب في صفحة مكان الشاتينج. بالنسبة للأسئلة باللغة الإنجليزية فقط رفع اليد وبإذن الله ناخذ الأدوار.
Okay, Malak.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Rena. I enjoyed your lecture so much, as I always admire your research work. I met you at least twice. I'm not sure, but I remembered once in Vienna and the other one in Bahrain. Do you remember me?
I think so, because I'm better at faces than names. So I remember your voice, and there were 2 or 3 women I had a chance to talk with in a room. We were sitting around.
Yes, symposium in Vienna. Yes. Okay, my first question, some domains start later at adolescent, like psychology, and that is because of environment factors. Do you think this may affect the field itself, because most bright children want to make their goals so early, and so we should make suitable interventions to solve that?
Yes, I would say this. If you think more kids should go into psychology, a good group to look at are the kids who are interested in science, or mathematics, who, when they get to university, they discover that the questions and the topics that they're really interested in studying scientifically are human behavior questions. If they knew about that earlier, in secondary school, for example, I think that would help a lot. I think they just don't know that science includes the science of behavior. So, but I would discourage any kind of focus on the therapeutic components that could tread into dangerous territory, talking about mental health issues, etc. So, because, well, anyway, I think you can understand why that could be.
Yes. Yes. The second question, we may all agree that we should identify and nurture performance giftedness and productive giftedness. Do you agree with me that performers are more fortunate than producers, so that we should consider special considerations for each, focusing on different psychosocial skills
Okay, and you said you think performers are more something than
Fortunate, yes.
specialists?
More lucky, yes. Fortunate. I think performers are more fortunate than producer because they can the public may admire them and acknowledge them like that, and maybe it is more easy for them to get into the public, while producer, for example, those people who try to contribute by research, it is only those in the field, only scholars in the field that acknowledge them and encourage them, you know. So we should, I think, if you agree with me, we should consider this while nurturing gifted or while pursuing gifted because of the different psychosocial that we should focus for both of them.
I agree with you 100%. And it's really hard. Last night, I was talking to an administrator at the National Institutes of Health, a friend of mine, and he's 95 years old. And then, you know, when he was a young man, being a scientific researcher was very prestigious. But now, I said to him, young people today can't find jobs in academia, you know.
Yes.
There are very few jobs, and if they feel like if they didn't win the Nobel Prize, that they're, you know, they live in anonymity, you know, they're just.
Yes, I agree with you.
So many of them then become doctors because then at least they feel like they can cure people. And so there has to be a reward system that helps people because we're all human. We all like to be recognized.
Yes.
And so, you know, encouraging, making a big deal about kids who are creators, even in the performance field, you know, being a choreographer or being a writer, you know, a script writer is not as publicly recognized. But certainly in the academic areas, making a big deal about it, you know, showing their stuff, getting them exposure would be so great.
Thank you so much.
We have some questions here.
إذا تخلين اللي رافعين يدينهم أول بعدين نقرأ مثل الأخت حنان.
تمام.
أو حيان، عفوا حيان. أوكي تفضلي قمرة ممكن الأسئلة المقروءة.
We have here a question. How do we teach our children the skills of persuasion, also the skills of how to be a good colleague or a student is loved by his teachers?
Ooh, it's really hard. So one way that works, I would argue, is if there's somebody they admire who talks to them about this. So if there's somebody you know who's well known, it's kind of like this. If you hear something about being a nice person and a good colleague from your mother, you respond to it differently than if you hear from it, let's say somebody you want to be like or you admire. And that person says to you, you know, if you're nice, you should be nice because it's the right thing to do. It's, you know, what God would want. It's what, you know, everything. But it also helps you make your life easier. If you're a nice person or polite or deferential, you know, if you know how to do these things. And So finding people that kids admire or have something they want, like gatekeepers. So somebody who does admission to the next, to a university, or who is a sports star or something, even if it's local, that helps a lot. And of course, you want to work with school psychologists who can help with that. And then there's some materials on teamwork. So think about this. Sometimes, I don't know how you do cooperative work in schools in Saudi Arabia, but there's a tradition in the US of cooperative learning where they put a bright, a very advanced student and two medium students and a weaker student together on purpose, and a lot of the really bright students hate this because they feel like they do all the work, and so they don't enjoy it. But if you put kids in a group where they're all experts in something, then that's training for the real adult work of working in teams. And after all, most work now is done in teams, right? If you're an astronaut, surgeon, a lot of the exciting fields is teamwork. And if you're not a good colleague, nobody wants to work with you. So those are just some ideas off the top of my head. And we're trying to develop some techniques for using persuasion. It's just in the beginning stages. I do have a video, it's very long. It's 2 hours of a forum that we did with a few experts in persuasion that I will give to Professor Abdullah. And if you want to watch it, you can.
Yeah.
I think it's really good, but it is, it's 2 hours but you could pick through it. And they talk about how they use persuasion in, climate change and in health. And you could start thinking, well, how could I do this with kids? So we are working on some modules for teachers to use with kids, but they're not done yet. I just wanted to plant the seed in case anybody got excited about this, because it's a very exciting area and important, very important.
Okay.
So I'm writing down, I'm going to send.
Yeah, please. Okay. Okay, we have just 5 minutes because Professor Rena has visitors right now after 5 minutes. So we have just 5 minutes. So if you could answer, we have a lot of questions here, maybe more than 30 questions or 4 or more. So we will get 1 or 2 more questions. And if you could answer them quickly. Yeah, go ahead, Kubra.
Yeah, there is a question. In your opinion, what is the most important aspect for talented people to research and focus on mathematics at the present time, especially for adults? Also, are there a common social features for gifted students in mathematics?
Okay, so you're saying for what's the most important thing to focus on for mathematics talent development?
Yeah.
And
the most important aspect in order to cultivate student who is giftedness in mathematics.
Okay, so those are two things. One is that mathematics is broader than school mathematics, and that there are outside of school activities. This is a Russian phenomenon. It's called math circles that are very popular in the US too. A lot of Russian immigrants who came and brought this, but it's adults and children who do recreational mathematics. They just, all kinds of interesting topics. For example, right now we're having a 17-year cycle of this insect the cicada. And why do they come prime numbers, right? So this, every 17 years they come, and then there's another brood of these insects that come every 13 years. So there are all kinds of really weird patterns in nature. And, you know, so these circles can excite kids who are really interested in mathematics. So finding these recreational math areas or Olympic math or anything else where kids are really all interested. The other is I'll send an article of a very small research study that we did on the psychosocial skill development of math talent. And it's just a start. So many of you are researchers yourselves, and I would strongly encourage you to think further about this. This is all frontier material. Okay, so may I send it to Dr. Abdullah? And
Yeah.
you know to whom to send it?
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Okay. So one more, let me say this because I have to go after one more question, but I'm happy to answer anything else. You know, I can respond by email or something. And then if you wish, Dr. Abdullah, it's up to you.
Okay. Okay, well, let's take one more question, yeah.
Also, there is another question related, how do we benefit from this model with to take care of exceptional students?
Well,
twice exceptional.
I think she needs twice exceptional
student.
Yeah, twice exceptional student, yeah.
The best I can say, because I'm not expert in this at all. I mean, it's a whole new specialty in our, maybe not new, but you know, more important specialty in our area now. The one thing that's good, especially good about talent development, is that many of these children with disabilities are domain-specific talented, right? Mm-hmm. They're just amazing in math or amazing in language, but they're deficient, or you know, their social skills get in the way in other areas, or they have a disability. So I think talent development is a boon. That attitude about domain-specific abilities is a boon to the 2E, the twice exceptional community. And they have accepted it much more readily than a lot of other communities.
Okay, thank you very much, Gumra. I just last request. I had many requests from my students here. They are asking if you have, if you could suggest ideas regarding their PhD thesis in this model, in this regard. Yeah.
Oh. Well, the big one, which may be bigger than a thesis, is how do you measure abilities in some other domains? I mean, we know a bit about mathematics, but what about writing or, you know, language? That, you know, specific abilities, and at what age could you discover? I mean, this is a big thing where you'd have to, but at least you could find, like we did, find the elements. And then once you have a career, you could start, well, how would I create an instrument? You know, but the abilities question is really big. Another one that we hope to work on, and doesn't mean that other people can't, is collecting insider knowledge in domains and organizing it so that it could be distributed to parents widely. So not just the privileged people know how to pick a teacher, how to pick a school, you know, etc. That you could share. How these social skills and mental skills, like you asked, who should teach them, and how do you train people to do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. Highly appreciate this wonderful presentation. I think You won the hearts of entire audience.
I'm sorry, say that again.
I said you won the hearts of entire audience here.
Oh, good.
I think many compliments and many comments came to me. They are very happy and very excited about what you just presented. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation and you sharing your knowledge in this field. Thank you for the time that you spent and preparing for this presentation. I know it's you have already so many arrangements. Also, if you allow me to thank Gomra for helping us with facilitating this meeting. Thank you for Mr. Hisham Mustafa, who voluntarily translate the presentation, and thank you for people in بالموهبة نرتقي, this group, volunteer group, who helped to organize this event. So thank you very much for everyone participated in this evening, and thank you very much again, Professor Rena, for the time that you spent with us, the knowledge that you shared with us, and we all highly appreciate all the work that you are doing, helping the people in the field understanding more giftedness and gifted students. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Salam alaikum.
عليكم السلام ورحمة الله. شكرا للجميع، نراكم على خير إن شاء الله في لقاءات قريبة بإذن الله.